Nobody on that freezing morning expected trouble. The sky over northern France looked calm, washed in a pale winter light that made the world feel deceptively quiet. The B-17 Red Annie drifted in formation with 40 other bombers, its engines humming with the heavy rhythm only crews understood that sound somewhere between confidence and fear. It was early 1944, and the air war over Europe had become a brutal contest of endurance. Every man aboard knew the Germans were getting desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. Inside the waist section of the bomber, a 19-year-old rookie named Sam Keller kept wiping his palms on his sheepskin jacket. He'd only flown 2 missions before this one. Most new gunners barely lasted a month. But Keller had this stubborn, almost reckless calm that puzzled the older men. They called him College Boy, even though he'd never finished high school. It wasn't a joke about intelligence, it was because he kept asking questions nobody bothered to ask anymore. Why do the fighters always attack from high angles? Why do some gunners score hits and others don't? Why do the Germans always seem to know when the formation is weak? That curiosity earned him respect, but also worry. There was a fine line between brave and stupid in the air, and nobody had time to figure out which side he stood on. The mission was supposed to be routine. Hit a railway junction feeding German supply lines. The crew of Red Annie had done harder runs before. The pilot, Lieutenant Briggs, a veteran of over 20 sorties, joked during briefing that the Luftwaffe was running on fumes. Keller had nodded politely, but he didn't believe that for a second. He'd seen too many gun camera reels showing swarms of German fighters tearing into bombers like wolves. Numbers didn't matter. All it took was one determined pilot, one lucky burst of cannon fire, one mistake. For the first hour, everything went smooth. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, lighting the frost on the wings. The radio chatter stayed light. The gunners scanned the sky through frosted glass and narrow openings, the cold biting through their gloves. Even in those cramped spaces, a strange quiet settled in. A stillness that made every heartbeat feel too loud. Keller, staring out from the waist gun, couldn't shake a strange tension in the formation. Something felt off. The lead bomber adjusted course twice. The contrails above them began to twist in the wind. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt the creeping certainty that they were being watched. He wasn't wrong. Far above, hidden in sunlight and distance, a group of 12 German fighters, a mix of Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds, had been tracking the formation for almost 10 minutes. Skilled pilots, some with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They had altitude, speed, and surprise. The perfect setup for an attack that could carve the bomber group apart in minutes. What the Americans didn't know was that these pilots had been hunting all morning, burning fuel, waiting for the right target. And now, they'd found it. It happened the way danger always reveals itself in war. Suddenly. A glint, just a tiny spark in the sky. Keller saw it first. He blinked, looked again. A dot, then 2, then a line of them, descending like hawks with the sun behind their backs. His breath caught. He slammed a fist against the metal frame and shouted over the intercom, his voice cracking with urgency. Other gunners confirmed it seconds later. The calm morning shattered. Inside Red Annie, the temperature somehow felt colder. The pilot steadied the bomber. The gunners snapped awake, pulling back their bolts, bracing their shoulders against the guns. Every man felt that jolt of instinct. This could be the moment their luck ran out. But Keller wasn't panicking. His nerves trembled, but his mind started racing. He remembered something he'd heard from a veteran waist gunner the night before. Not a rule, not something in a manual. Just an offhand comment, almost a joke. Something about spooking fighters before they attack. It didn't make sense then. But now, with 12 German fighters diving toward them, the words clicked into place. A crazy idea formed. A stupid one, by normal standards. The kind of thing that could get him chewed out by the pilot or even court-martialed if he messed up. But something inside him, that same stubborn curiosity, pushed him to try. He glanced toward the closing fighters. They were moving fast. Too fast. If he waited until they were in range, it would be too late. And if the formation broke, those 12 fighters could rip them apart. Keller's heart hammered as he set his feet, leaned into the gun, and prepared to gamble the lives of everyone on board on something no rookie should ever attempt. What he was about to do was not in any manual, not in any training film, not in any order he'd ever heard. It was reckless, borderline ridiculous, and yet, in that frozen moment, it felt like the only option left. He took a breath, steadying his hands. Outside, the German fighters were now close enough for the crews to see the sunlight glinting off their wings. And that was when Sam Keller made the choice that would forever mark his name in the squadron's history. A three-step trick, one nobody else would have dared, one he'd only pieced together from scraps of overheard advice and instinct. A trick so unexpected, so foolish-sounding, that within minutes it would force 12 battle-hardened German pilots to do something no one aboard Red Annie had ever witnessed before. They would turn away. But at this moment, no one knew that. All they knew was that a rookie gunner was about to do something unthinkable, and the sky was about to explode. The first seconds felt like the air itself tightened around the bomber. The German fighters spread slightly, adjusting formation, wings tilting in perfect coordination. They were lining up for a classic high-side attack, the kind that tore open dozens of American bombers every month. The crew braced. They'd seen this before. Usually, it ended with smoke, flames, or the sickening shake of metal being shredded. But just before the fighters dropped into firing range, Sam Keller made his move. He didn't wait for the order. He didn't wait for the perfect angle. He didn't even wait for the Germans to commit to the dive. He opened fire. A long, wild, utterly premature burst that ripped through the sky way ahead of where any crew was trained to aim. It startled the men around him. Nobody fired that early. It was considered pointless, a waste of ammunition, a rookie mistake that gave away your rhythm. The pilot's voice snapped through the intercom asking who fired, but Keller barely heard him. He was focused on step one of the strange piece of advice he'd overheard. Shoot early enough, and they rethink their angle. He didn't understand exactly why, but the effect was immediate. The leading German pilot jerked his aircraft slightly off course, just a twitch, but the fighter next to him, trying to stay in formation, adjusted too. The line of descending aircraft rippled like a wave disturbed by a stone. That single hesitation bought the bomber formation a few precious seconds, and seconds mattered more than altitude in a fight like this. But Keller wasn't done. Step 2 followed instantly. He yanked the gun hard in the opposite direction and unleashed a second bizarre burst, not at the fighters, but deliberately wide, tracing a pattern that made no sense to anyone watching. Even his own crewmates stared at him, confused. It looked like panic fire, the kind of desperate spray a terrified gunner might release in his final moments. But Keller had a specific reason. He remembered the veteran gunner's words. If you make him think you're not terrified, he gets nervous. If you make him think you're unpredictable, he backs off. Keller's erratic burst forced the Germans to reconsider the threat. They had no idea if he was a poor shot or a dangerously good one deliberately baiting them. Unpredictable fire was rare from bombers, and unpredictability was feared by fighter pilots. It meant the bomber might not follow the usual defenses. It meant the gunner might be experienced, or reckless enough not to care about ammunition. Either way, it shifted the balance of fear. And then came step 3, the one Keller wasn't even sure would work. He stopped firing. Completely. No follow-up, no adjustment, nothing. Just silence. Any normal gunner would have continued laying down suppressive fire. Every instinct said to keep shooting. But Keller trusted something he'd only half understood from the veteran's story. When you fire early, then fire wild, then go silent, he thinks you're tracking him. He thinks you've picked your moment. That silence was a message, a threat without words. And unbelievably, it worked. The German fighters, now unsure of the gunner who'd just broken every rule, tightened formation. That alone was a sign of hesitation. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots preferred space, but fear compressed them. They dipped again, ready to commit to the attack, but then the unexpected happened. One fighter broke away. Not a retreat, just a shift, as the pilot adjusted to get a better angle. But to the unit leader, it was enough. That movement told him someone wasn't confident. Someone saw something he didn't. Someone was worried about the bomber's gunners. And in air combat, doubt spreads faster than exhaust smoke. Within seconds, the tight German attack formation dissolved into loose individual approaches. And loose approaches were vulnerable. The cohesion was gone. Their advantage evaporated. Keller's crew watched, stunned, as the fighters truly hesitated in mid-attack. Then something even stranger happened. One German pilot fired a brief warning burst, not at the bombers, but off to the side. It wasn't an attack, it was a signal to his wingman, a sign of misalignment, a sign of stress. The American-led bomber's tail gunner, seeing the confusion, opened fire for real, accurate, precise, controlled. That was the breaking point. The Germans peeled off, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a series of small turns, abort motions, shallow climbs, the kind of measured withdrawal pilots made when something felt wrong, when instinct whispered that pushing forward wasn't worth it, when the situation no longer made sense. Keller stared through the waist window, unable to believe what he'd just witnessed. 12 fighters, 12 aggressive, seasoned Luftwaffe pilots, backing away. He hadn't hit anything, hadn't even been close, but he had done something nobody on board could explain. He had disrupted their confidence. Inside the bomber, the crew erupted in disbelief. Some laughed, some cursed. Some slapped Keller on the shoulder so hard he winced. The pilot, catching his breath, radioed the squadron leader that the attack had been aborted. But here's the strange part. Nobody could agree why. The bombardier thought the Germans saw Mustangs approaching, but none were. The navigator assumed the enemy misjudged fuel. The pilot suspected a radio miscommunication among the fighters. Not a single man connected the retreat to what the rookie gunner had done. Only Keller sat quietly, replaying the 3 steps in his head. Shoot early, shoot wide, go silent. A trick with no logic, no textbook application, and no guarantee. A trick he might never try again. Yet something in it had pierced the psychology of fighter pilots, men trained to read signs, instincts, threats, and mistakes in a fraction of a second. Later investigations into German pilot reports revealed a truth pilots rarely discussed: fear of hidden skill. Luftwaffe fighters respected disciplined, predictable gunners, but they were wary of wild ones. Wild meant unpredictable. Unpredictable meant dangerous. Dangerous meant maybe it wasn't worth the risk. And on that cold morning, against all odds, a 19-year-old rookie had made 12 hardened fighter pilots feel exactly that. The bomber continued its mission. The formation tightened. The sky, once tense, slowly relaxed. And while the crew celebrated their narrow escape, Keller stared into the fading horizon, wondering if anyone would ever believe what had actually happened. Nobody asked him how he'd done it. Nobody questioned why the fighters retreated. And he wasn't sure he could explain it clearly, even if they did. All he knew was that the trick had worked. But the most shocking part of the story, the part that would only be understood after the mission, was still waiting ahead. What those German pilots thought they saw, what they misinterpreted in those chaotic seconds, and why that misinterpretation changed everything for both sides. That revelation would come later, and it would be far more unbelievable than the trick itself. The mission's final hour felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos they'd just escaped. The black smoke rising from the bombed railway yards curled upward like slow-moving shadows, blending into the winter sky. Red Annie turned toward home, engines rumbling evenly, a tired giant making its way back across enemy territory. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Keller stayed by his gun, staring into the empty sky where the 12 fighters had vanished. Part of him kept expecting them to regroup, to come roaring back in a second wave. But the horizon remained quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that invites doubt. Did they really turn away because of him? Or was it coincidence? A trick of timing? Even he wasn't sure. Hours later, when the bombers landed at their English airbase and rolled to a stop on the rain-slicked tarmac, the crew climbed out exhausted. Mechanics swarmed the aircraft. Officers waited with clipboards. And the men of Red Annie were ushered toward debriefing, still buzzing with leftover tension. Inside the briefing hut, warmed by a battered cast-iron stove, the crew dropped into their chairs. One by one, they described what had happened. The fighters approaching, the formation tightening, the sudden retreat. The intelligence officers listened intently, scribbling notes. But something didn't add up. Highly disciplined German pilots never abandoned a perfect attack run without a reason. Then a radio intercept operator walked into the room carrying a sheet of decoded German chatter. She handed it to the intelligence officer, who read it twice, eyebrows rising. He looked up at the crew. "Looks like they thought you had fighter cover." The room erupted in confusion. Fighter cover? There were no American fighters anywhere near them. Everyone knew that. The P-51 escorts had been forced to break off earlier. They were alone the entire time. But the officer explained something that changed the way the crew understood the encounter forever. During the chaos of Keller's bizarre firing pattern, the early burst, the unpredictable sweep, the sudden silence, the German pilots believed they'd seen the signature pattern of a Mustang diving in from above. The bright glint off the bomber's metal combined with the muzzle flash distortions created the illusion of a fighter shifting position behind the formation. For a split second, the Germans thought they weren't facing just bombers, but a hidden escort ready to pounce. That illusion, combined with Keller's unnatural timing, convinced the enemy leader that he was flying into a trap. Pilots live and die by instinct, and in that moment, his instincts screamed that something was wrong. So he pulled his squadron off the attack, not because they were afraid of the bombers, but because they imagined a threat that wasn't there. A 19-year-old rookie had accidentally triggered one of the Luftwaffe's deepest fears: invisible American fighters. The crew looked at Keller, stunned. He shrugged awkwardly, unsure whether to feel proud, lucky, or embarrassed. But the intelligence officer wasn't done. He pointed to the intercepted notes and underlined a line. "Enemy reports say the waist gunner on your ship displayed irregular fire, characteristic of advanced training. They believed you were masking the presence of escorts." The room burst into laughter, slaps on the back, disbelief. Keller tried to hide his smile, cheeks burning. The idea that German pilots mistook his improvised trick for the work of a veteran Mustang escort team felt surreal, almost ridiculous. But it was true. Then came the moment nobody forgot. The squadron commander, a stern man not known for humor, walked in with a cup of black coffee and said, "Whoever that waist gunner is, I want him on every mission." The room roared. Even Keller laughed, though quietly. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure he understood why the trick had worked. But something inside him shifted that day. Not confidence, something deeper. The realization that war wasn't just about firepower or training. It was about perception, timing, psychology. The tiny decisions made in a single heartbeat. That afternoon, after the reports were filed and the crew was dismissed, Keller stepped outside into the wind. The sun was sinking low, turning the clouds red. The noise of engines echoed faintly across the field, a reminder that more missions were coming, more dangers ahead. He knew the trick wouldn't always work. He knew he wasn't invincible. But he also knew something else, something he couldn't put into words. That sometimes, survival depended on daring to break the pattern, daring to be unpredictable, daring to do something everyone else considered foolish. A stupid three-step trick. One he might never use again. One he had done out of pure instinct, desperation, and a rookie's strange courage. But on that cold morning over France, that foolish idea saved an entire bomber formation from being torn apart. Years later, when veterans told the story, they always emphasized the same point: not the retreat, not the misunderstanding, not the intelligence intercept. They talked about the moment a 19-year-old kid, scared but steady, made a decision nobody expected, and changed the outcome of a battle before it even began. Some stories of war are about precision, some are about strategy, and some, like this one, are about a single heartbeat of madness that becomes a miracle. The sky closed behind Red Annie that day. The German pilots moved on, never knowing they'd been fooled by a burst of wild gunfire and the imagination of a rookie. And Sam Keller, the kid they called College Boy, the kid who never finished school, walked back toward the barracks with frost on his jacket and a new understanding of the war he had stepped into. Sometimes courage doesn't look like bravery. Sometimes it looks like a stupid trick that shouldn't work, until the moment it does.